I'm completely sold on Exodus, and it actually has almost nothing to do with their extended gameplay reveal they dropped a few days ago. I think Exodus should be your most anticipated game for 2027, and to elucidate my thinking behind that, I'm going to use a mix of philosophical and psychological concepts to explain why Exodus's story could be generational. Stick around for just 15 minutes and we'll have fun and you'll learn something. Without further ado, let's get into today's agenda. Before we get into the concepts, I think it's important to set the stage a bit. If you think about the stories that have meant the most to you in your life, I can almost guarantee you that regardless of which story that is, be it a book, a movie, or a video game, there are two key components that dictate the story's effect on you. First is whether or not it blazes a trail across your consciousness. In other words, does the story introduce a new theme or concept that you haven't heard of? Does it show you something you'd never seen before? Or does it provoke you to view something in a new light? In the most basic sense, whether you realize it or not, as humans, when stories teach us something profound or open up a neural pathway that allows us to view life differently, that is when the story is resonant and enters the indelible mark territory in terms of impact. The second component that determines the story's impact is relatability. I'll be brief here because I think everyone probably can understand this at face value, but I'll give this statement some anecdotal support, right? So my favorite movie ever is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and the main reason, on top of the beautiful animation and music, is that it was the first time I witnessed representation of myself and my experiences in the mainstream media to that degree. It wasn't just that Miles, the main character, looks like me, it was also that his character arc throughout the film mirrored my own life experiences in ways that I just hadn't seen before. A less personal example from the video game space would be the success of Expedition 33, a game that we now look back on and can see is the game that has won the most Game of the Year awards in gaming history. The driving force of this success was the story, and the story was so widely successful mainly because its themes were universal. Everyone across the vast and diverse spectrum of human experience could relate to Claire Obscure's main theme. With that established, I want to explain how Exodus's story, specifically its setting, is actually the main reason I am sold on this game's success being inevitable, and why I think we can all be very optimistic about the game's story. The aspect of Exodus's setting that has me fully believing in the project is Exodus's commitment to dealing with the concept of time dilation. Time dilation, in the most simple sense, is the phenomenon where time passes at different rates for different observers. The idea is that the faster you travel, the slower time passes for you relative to people who stay behind. So if you spend a few days traveling near the speed of light, years might pass for everyone back home. For example, you leave Earth on a mission, the mission feels like 2 weeks to you, you return, 20 years have passed on Earth. You aged 2 weeks, everyone else aged 20 years. The science actually comes from Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, but narratively, the important part is simple. You can never get time back, and every journey through the stars costs you a piece of your life with the people you leave behind. The idea in Exodus is that a lot of what you're doing is driven by the motivation to save your dying homeworld. So many or all of your choices out and about in the galaxy is in service of that goal. So throughout the game, you'll be seeing the ramifications of your actions and choices, not just in the present, but you'll see how they ripple down future generations as well due to time dilation. So that's fucking cool, and I want to explain why using philosophy and psychology. The first philosophical concept I want to discuss is the philosophy of Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher from thousands of years ago who famously said that no man ever steps in the same river twice. The reasoning is simple. The river is constantly changing, but also, so is the man. In Exodus, every time the protagonist returns home, they'll be returning to a world that is only the same in their mind. In spite of them only being weeks older, they'll come back to a world that has aged years or even decades. I think what makes this the most compelling is that when you think about it, this isn't just science fiction. I reckon that almost every one of you watching this video has experienced some version of this. Just the other day, my brother went back to our hometown for the first time in years, and he texted me basically in awe at all the things that had changed, but also all of the things that were still the same. For you, it could be an old college or school or a family reunion or a simple hangout with an old friend. It could be the simple act of looking at an old photo. The bottom line is that as humans, we are forced to reconcile with the idea of reality constantly flowing forwards and never being able to have the world exactly as we have it in the present. The world your pictures capture stops existing the moment that you take them. The word, of course, is nostalgia. Nostalgia is basically us mourning the fact that a particular version of life can never truly be revisited. Even if the people and places remain, the moment itself is gone forever. Every one of you knows what that feels like. We've all had moments that we wish we could go back to. We've all looked back on periods of our lives and realized we didn't fully appreciate them until they were already behind us. And that's what makes the premise of Exodus so powerful. Time dilation takes one of the most relatable aspects of the human condition, the pain of watching time carry the things we love further and further away, and it turns it into a central mechanic of the story. Not only that, but the fact we exist outside of a more rapidly moving homeworld timeline means that it will grant us new perspective about how to think about our present, our past, and our future. And this naturally leads us into another philosophical concept called impermanence. Many philosophical traditions argue that suffering emerges from our desire to hold on to things that cannot be held on to. Families and communities, relationships, these all change. People die, and yet we spend much of our lives trying to pretend these things are permanent. Exodus's time dilation will strip away that illusion. The protagonist is forced to confront something that most of us spend our lives avoiding, at least until we lose something permanently. The idea that everything is temporary. Every goodbye matters because it may genuinely be the last one. Every conversation carries weight because there is no guarantee you'll ever have another. The setting itself in Exodus creates emotional stakes before the writers have even written a single line of dialogue, it's why I feel the floor for this game's story is so high, right? Like, I have no clue if they'll reach the ceiling of Exodus's potential in terms of the writing, though I'm optimistic since there are many people from the original Mass Effect trilogy involved. But the floor is so high to me. Even if the writing is somehow ass, the game's story can only be so bad because its setting is so profound and intellectually provocative. For example, another psychological concept that sits in my mind when wondering about Exodus's story is something called anticipatory grief. Most people think grief solely begins after loss, but if you study psychology, you know that people often begin grieving before the loss occurs. People experience this when a parent is aging, they experience it when a loved one is terminally ill, they experience it during major life transitions. The loss hasn't happened yet, but they can see it coming. In Exodus, I think that every departure from your homeworld will be emotionally charged with that feeling, right? And it isn't just death. Maybe you'll go on a mission and leave behind a close friend and be deeply aware that when you get back, there'll be an old man or woman getting ready for the end of their life. Or maybe you'll leave a friend who's pregnant and come back to an adult child, a niece or nephew whose entire life you missed. It would be diabolical as well if you romance someone who doesn't travel with you, because by the time you get back, Lord knows what that would look like. And I haven't even talked about the flip side, right? For all of your loved ones on your homeworld, they literally have to live out their lives literally not knowing if you're alive or not, because you could very well die out there on your mission and you're doing dangerous shit. I mean, God forbid you come back after they have already passed away. They would have died not knowing if you're even alive or not. But yeah, in this story, you will leave knowing that when you return, something important will be irreparably altered or gone entirely. And what's profound is it isn't because of some supervillain or op who has it out for you, but because of time itself. I think it's super clever to kind of make time one of the major antagonists, if you will, of a game's story. It's powerful because in real life, time is also our antagonist. Remember what I said about the best and most impactful stories being relatable and causing you to think about things in a new light? Well, every single human can relate to the struggle against time. To continue along, though, another philosophical concept that comes to mind is the ship of Theseus. The ship of Theseus, in the most basic sense, is the quandary that if every plank of a ship is gradually replaced over time to maintain the ship, is it still the same ship? Like, all of the original pieces are gone, right? But is it still the same ship in spite of that? Well, Exodus turns that question onto people. Imagine leaving Earth for 2 days, but when you land back down, it's somehow 30 years later. Imagine you were the parent of a 2-year-old daughter. They're still your daughter, but basically every single plank of your relationship and dynamic has changed. So has every single plank of her identity. If your experiences diverge enough, at what point do you become strangers? Does the label daughter even make sense for her anymore? And that philosophical question connects to a psychological concept called identity continuity. Human beings like to believe that we're fundamentally the same person throughout our lives. It's part of how we make sense of ourselves, and it's part of how we create a coherent narrative about who we are. But what happens when everyone around you experiences decades of growth while you experience only months? At some point, the protagonist may begin to feel disconnected not only from society but from themselves. And that raises a fascinating question. How much change can a person endure before they stop feeling like they belong? I'm definitely eager to see how they play around with the concept of humanity and retaining your sense of social belonging when your life experiences sit so far outside of everyone else's. If June, the protagonist, has his human foundations that I just mentioned challenged enough, like his identity continuity and his constantly changing planks of his own metaphorical ship of Theseus, at what point does his character fracture or become something different? Huge potential, I think, for a god complex for somebody in this position to develop, especially when you're making decisions on behalf of your home planet and you will be actively seeing the long-term ramifications of your decisions. While I don't think a protagonist going insane is the way they'll go, I definitely could see us running into other travelers in this game who maybe have lost too much of themselves due to constantly sitting in the throes of time dilation, and it would be very fascinating to go toe-to-toe with people like that. I want to end on kind of an overarching statement that kind of envelops everything I've talked about up until now, and that is that ultimately time dilation is forcing us to confront mortality. Not necessarily just death itself, but the reality that time is limited. Psychologists have a term called mortality salience, which refers to what happens when people become aware of their own finite existence. When humans are reminded that time is limited, their priorities change. Relationships become more important, meaning becomes more important. The trivial things, they suddenly matter less. And Exodus seems uniquely positioned to keep both the player and the protagonist constantly aware of that reality. Every single mission will carry a hidden question. What is this moment worth? What is this relationship worth? What is this year of my life worth? And that's where I think Exodus moves beyond simply being a cool science fiction premise and enters genuinely profound territory. Because underneath all the spaceships and alien worlds, the game appears to be grappling with one of the oldest philosophical questions humanity has ever asked. What gives life meaning? Existentialist philosophers argue that meaning isn't discovered, it's created. One of the hardest truths about life is that we rarely get to see the final consequences of our actions. The best example is Vincent van Gogh. He's thought of as one of the best artists in the history of mankind. But if you didn't know, he literally died before he became famous. In other words, he died not knowing his name ended up being world-renowned and that his work paid off in the end. What makes it even more tragic is he died to mental illness. Had recognition come earlier, would he have lived a longer life? Who knows, but I'm getting away from my point. My point is, most of us spend our lives planting trees whose shade we'll never sit under. I'll say that again. Most of us spend our lives planting trees whose shade we'll never sit under. And that's why I think this final psychological concept may end up being the most profound one to consider when it comes to Exodus. It's a concept called generativity. Generativity is the human desire to contribute something meaningful to future generations, to leave the world better than we found it, to build something that outlasts us. And when I think of Exodus, I keep coming back to that idea, because the protagonist is constantly sacrificing their present for a future they may never fully inhabit. Even if they call it quits one day, it will inevitably be in a world that they don't know and that doesn't know them. The protagonist will fight for people they may never meet. They will protect civilizations that may look completely different by the time they return. They will spend their lives investing in tomorrows that they themselves might never get to experience. And when you look at it through that lens, Exodus isn't really a story about space travel at all. It's a story about one of the most human questions imaginable. What are we willing to give up today for a tomorrow we may never see? And if Exodus is willing to seriously explore that question, then I don't just think it has the potential to be a good science fiction story. I think it has the potential to be one of the most emotionally resonant stories in gaming. Before I log off, I just want to say thank you infinitely for watching this video. Please check out the other videos on my channel for more content like this, and there's links in the description if you want to support the channel or join our Discord where we talk about life and video games and all that type of stuff every day. Have a great day, night, or morning, and remember to be kind and thoughtful.